very painful, I think, being ostracized for having the wrong opinions.
Yeah.
It's so unnecessary, and that's one of the great tragedies of the time, I think, is I think they'll look back and realize, so what, they had different opinions.
Right.
And Thomas Jefferson said, if we all think the same, then no one's thinking.
Right.
You'd think at university that diversity of thought would be cherished,
Right.
particularly in America, of all places.
Well, Winston, thank you so much for joining me. You're the former lead guitarist and banjo player for Mumford Sons, and in a really courageous move, I think, you resigned from the band that you loved, and you've gone on to do really amazing work in journalism, in the media, in civil rights activism. It's been really interesting to watch.
Well, Audrey, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure. I'm very grateful to you and your team at University of Austin to have invited me out to Dallas, although I was a bit disappointed. I mean, nothing against Dallas. I had hoped it would be in Austin, but it's fun. It's good to be in Texas.
Next time.
Next time.
So I want to start by asking you about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, because you quote him in your resignation letter. I love that you quote him, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the first time you read his work and how perhaps he's guided you.
I did quote Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Part of what I quoted was his, when he left, when he was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974, he published a letter called Live Not by Lies. It's about 4 or 5 pages long. And I quoted it because it's a piece of writing that had a big impact on me. So when I was in the band, I tweeted about a book that was critical of the BLM protests in Antifa, and it turned into a huge Twitter storm, went up all the trending charts, and all sorts of activists came after me and mine and my bandmates. And I was in a position where I'd say I was forced to apologize, and part of me accepts some responsibility in that apology, but I wanted to do everything to make it right by the people I worked with. And then over the next few months, I dug deep into the topic, realized I had actually not been wrong. I had Antifa should be criticized as a real situation. There are a lot of problems with the BLM riots and protests. And I felt that apology hung around my neck like a sort of tablet of shame. And all the while I was reading that essay came up, I think, I don't know how I found it, and there's a line in it, and it's, how dare you call yourself, amongst other things, it includes an artist if you're not prepared to pursue the truth, live by your convictions. I paraphrase, but I recommend to listeners to find that essay. And I think I must have read it 3, 4, maybe 5 times in the 3 months that followed, and I felt, I mean, it's a much longer story, but the short story is, I felt that who am I to be an artist if I don't live by my convictions? And so I felt the only real way forward was me to quit the band, and I published a letter explaining my decision and cited that part of Solzhenitsyn. You asked, when did I first get into Solzhenitsyn? Well, I think I read Ivan Denisovich when I was a teenager.
Nice.
But I'm not sure I had certainly didn't have sufficient knowledge of Russian history, and it perhaps felt a bit alien to me in sort of 90s London or noughties London.
Right.
And so I guess I didn't fully appreciate that until I really started studying the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. And so I had got quite deep into that. Also, his book, this 3-volumed Gulag Archipelago, I think the first volume of which is just so dense with wisdom. There are famous lines like the line between good and evil cuts through the center of every human heart. An exploration of life and humanity in a totalitarian, genocidal system. That book, it's incredibly moving and just, it's quite difficult to read, but an important one. So that book's very important to me. So those, I mean, I just read actually In the First Circle, which is his novel, which is actually not really spoken about. Is it In the First Circle or in the Inner Circle or something? It's a reference to Dante. And it's an amazing novel.
Yeah.
And have you read it?
It's been on my list for a while. One of my favorite quotes, I think, comes from that book about how no government has ever loved a great writer because great writers always challenge the status quo. But it's something I've been meaning to read for a while now.
It's really worth reading. There's also an amazing description of Stalin. I mean, it's fictional, but it's the most real description of Stalin that I've ever read. And so that book really does a great job of portraying life in the Soviet Union, and actually, you know, Solzhenitsyn. So he wrote that great fiction. He wrote Gulag Archipelago, which is it's very experimental writing. I'm not sure what category you could put it. It's not quite. It's almost. Is it journalistic or it's not? It's certainly not fiction. It's a documentation of what was going on. So he wrote that. Then a lot of these great short stories. He also wrote an incredible history of the Soviet Union. So he's one of the great historians. He, unbelievable and prolific writer.
Yeah.
In fact, his speeches as well. When he first came to, this is another thing that was a big inspiration to me, was when he first came to America after his expulsion in 1974, and he did some tours of Europe and tours the States. And he did a handful of university speeches, which are published in the Warning to the West. What was incredible is that he could have been a hero of the West. He could have said, screw the Soviet Union. They're totalitarians. And he, of course, would have been, in his height of the Cold War, he would have been absolutely adored here. Instead, he turned his wrath on the States and criticized the West. And that's a big inspiration. And then also he then went away to Connecticut and, no, not Connecticut, Vermont. Upstate, in the middle of nowhere, Vermont. And he's like, I'm not going to do all of this out in the woods, chopping wood, and I'm going to just put my head down and write. And he was a really dedicated, serious artist. So there's just so many things about him that are incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, well, he's a hero of mine for many reasons, but he gave a speech to Harvard, and it's remarkable to me because, as you say, he had the opportunity to be this hero of the West, and yet he was so principled and in many ways saw where we were headed as a society and did not withhold his criticisms of the West, which I find really, really fascinating. And your resignation letter from Mumford and Sons is remarkable, and that here you are in this really difficult time, for lack of a better word, and you're juggling so much as a person, and yet you're somehow able to situate the moment you're living through historically, which I think is so rare, that you were able to, inciting Solzhenitsyn, and I just found something really, really remarkable about the way that your letter references the Holocaust and the Soviet Union, and you seem very interested in history and how that can help us better understand where we are today.
Say that was, well, obviously that letter was intentional in that I wanted to get a clearer understanding of my decision, but it wasn't. I wasn't intentionally trying to make it some sort of historical. I'm just a shit-kicker banjo player. I'm not for a second claiming that my experience is anything like Solzhenitsyn, who was in the Gulag or on the front line against the Nazis, or battling cancer. It wasn't. And the reference to the Holocaust was that in criticizing Antifa, if you're against Antifa, it's a classic wordplay thing. Oh, you must be pro-fascist. Well, no. It so happens that I even feel I debated about whether or not to include this information because it felt slightly dirty using it, but I needed to give context for the lunacy of the situation. It was that my grandma was a Holocaust survivor. All her family were killed in the camps or on the death marches. And so the idea that I would be called Nazi is just ludicrous. And sometimes you need to spell something out to just make that clear. So I felt like I had to include it, but I'm certainly not comparing my situation to my grandma's or Solzhenitsyn.
And you made that very clear because, as you say, obviously we're not living in the Soviet Union. Obviously we're not living under Nazi Germany. But I think the manner in which you handled the situation with nuance was really interesting. And I wanted to ask you as well about your transition from, as you say, sleeping on pub floors to traveling the world as this famous musician. You know, what was that like for you at the time?
Mumford Sons I was in the band 14 years from the beginning until 2 years ago, and it was a ride of a lifetime. We were lucky boys, those three guys, incredibly talented, and there was nothing like the magic of being on stage. And that's the thing I miss actually, is being on stage. Those 2 hours on stage, it's a sacred space, and it's the place where you're freed and liberated from all worldly concerns. You go into another place, and when you're in the flow, it's I haven't yet found another place quite like that. I certainly miss it, but we had a great musical chemistry, and I'm very proud of the 4 albums. We made a few EPs as well, and the music we did, I really am proud of it. And it was the experience of a lifetime.
And what advice would you have to aspiring musicians who perhaps are deterred by the climate we find ourselves in? Do you have advice for them moving forward for, building their careers right now?
I'm concerned by the self-censorship and fear in the creative industries. There seems to be two sort of categories. I have a lot of messages from people saying they're self-censoring, saying they'd read the same books, saying they had critiques of the BLM protests as well. They couldn't speak, let's say you take a band setting, you go into the studio. If there are topics which are taboo, which you're not allowed to talk about, what that does to your mind is that, okay, you check everything you say, you filter it. Now, then you pick up an instrument. Your mind is still in the same, it's programmed the same way. So you're not free. And so that, I think, can only lead to lackluster, milquetoast creation. Now, there's plenty of artists who that is not a problem for, and I wouldn't say it's the blanket case for all the art that's coming out at the moment. And I'd also say that there are some very free-speaking artists who just happen to have progressive opinions and are not going to lose their business partnerships or artistic partnerships as a consequence of their opinions. And I can go. There's a long list of people in the creative industries who were. Last week, 2 weeks ago, a guy from Take That. His name is Donald Howard. He got taken down from a festival because they found some tweets he said that were gender critical. And then he came off Twitter. Then there's a keyboard player from Elbow. He's gay. I think his name is a guy called Craig Potter. I think his name. Again, gender critical opinions. There's a guy called Christian Henderson from Spitfire Audio. He created this studio company where they, as well as recording music, producing music, they created music for softwares. He started the foundation, the organization, the company, and was forced to quit eventually. Look at how J.K. Rowling's been treated. This week, an indie musician called John Mouse, who was at the Capitol Hill on January 6th. Actually, sorry, I don't know that he was at Capitol Hill. He was at January 6th. He might have been at the preceding rally.
Okay.
But he has since apologized, expressed solidarity against all forms of fascism, and he got kicked off a festival called 100% Electronica or something like that. Ariel Pink was not at the Capitol Hill storming. He's an indie artist. He was at the preceding Trump rally and then went to bed. He was dropped by his label by text message when they found out about that.
Wow.
MIA, who's a Sri Lankan British hip-hop rapper, earlier this year was nixed from Field Day Festival in London because of her. They were vague about it, but they said it was because of her politics that expressed online. I looked into her politics expressed online. I found that she had criticisms of the vaccines, and so that's the sort of worst. If that is the crime, that's the worst thing. Which seems, look how not just people who are pro-vaccine, people who are critical of vaccines. It was a traumatic thing for everyone. She was worried about her children, I think. The point being, and I could go on. This is just the creative industries. If you have the wrong opinions, you are punished for having the wrong opinions. This is because I think it's I don't know. I don't have data on this. Either the creative industries are overwhelmingly progressive and they stifle dissenting voices, or a minority of progressives chokehold the rest of people in the industry. And this has a big impact. If you're dropped from a music festival, let's say like MIA was,
right.
Those fees that they get at music festivals, that's a big bulk of their income. You don't get that much from streaming. You get money from maybe getting a clip on, a sync on advertising, but the festivals, it's a lot of money from that. So if they lose that sort of income, then it affects the whole budget for the whole touring cycle. So a young artist who doesn't have very much money, who is dependent on that, will look, oh, that's what happened when she said that, I better keep stum. And I know artists who keep stum. I've got friends who are like, I agree with you, I'm coming offline, I'm like, I don't want to say anything because I actually don't want to lose my work for saying the wrong thing. So there's a climate of fear. It's insane. And as I stated, what effect that has on the art itself, we shall see. There's a positive spin on it as well, is that, again, not to be dramatic and compare, to the Soviet Union, but Dostoevsky said, Ernest Hemingway said of Dostoevsky that Dostoevsky was forged in the prison. It was pre-Gulag, forged in the camps, like a sword is. A writer is forged in injustice, like a sword is forged in the fire. So I hope that what comes from this is greater art, and we shall see. We shall see.
Right. I hope so too. And clearly, it's a global problem. I mean, it's astounding in the worst of ways, the number of people that you just listed. And I wonder if you've noticed a difference in the climate between the United States and the UK, if the culture is slightly different right now. I mean, obviously there are differences culturally, but in terms of censorship, have you witnessed a difference?
I think it's very similar. American artists as well as British artists DM me privately. I would never betray their trust by revealing who they are.
Right.
So it seems to be pretty similar. There are some differences, but this might not be a direct answer to your question. Let's say you take the gender critical movement, the women's rights movement.
Yeah.
In this country, it seems to be largely split along political lines. I'm sure there are certainly some anomalies, and there are liberals who are gender critical. But in Britain, the issue has split down the middle of left and down the middle of the right. So the famous example is J.K. Rowling. I believe she's a lifelong Labour supporter, and she's TERF enemy number one to the TRAs. And whereas here only this morning, GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which is a 1980s NGO, published a letter with hundreds, or I didn't count exactly how many, artists, including Jamil, what's her name? Jamil, and Wanda Sykes, and Zooey Deschanel, and a host of others, prominent artists, calling on social media companies to censor people, and this is specific to the trans issue. They want censorship, and you can look specifically what they want. It's worth your listeners your viewers having a look at this letter, but includes they want censorship of people dead naming or misgendering people, because apparently that's harmful, and they also want censorship of what they call disinformation on life-affirming, gender-affirming, critical healthcare for minors. Now, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Imagine if you were like, if it was lobotomy, you can't, and if you were to criticize lobotomy, no, we need to censor people criticizing lobotomy when it was when it was still practiced.
Right.
Except that we know the science is clear. We know what we're doing to children. It's completely immoral. We're sterilizing them by doing this care. It's irreversible. It has horrible. They can't even get sexual pleasure, which means, by the way, that they can't form lifelong bonded relations. That's a form of bonding. It's absolutely heinous what they're doing. But these artists are saying we need to. What I just said would be an example of something that they would deem worth censoring. So these artists actively want more censorship on an issue where the science clearly, and not to mention the ethics, clearly doesn't support their side of the argument. But they're compelled by their concept of compassion, and it's horrific. It's really shocking. So I forget your original question, but certainly there's a problem in the arts, and free speech and censorship is, they're actively calling. In the 1980s, I think it was 1989, Ice-T had a song called Freedom of Speech because the moral majoritarians, conservatives like Tipper Gore, is that her name, Tipper Gore? Al Gore's wife.
Oh, no. Okay.
They wanted to censorship music to protect kids, and it wasn't conservatives who were asking for censorship. It was conservatives who were asking for censorship, and the liberals, artists, saying no, freedom of speech. Well, now it's completely flipped. The artists want censorship, and freedom of speech. Well, where's it coming from? Who's actually supporting it? It's an upside down world. Right.
It's despicable. I mean, and I look at colleges and universities, and in the 1960s it was the left really championing free speech, and now many of those same academics are in positions of power at our universities, and now they're the ones pushing for censorship. And yet, hearing you talk, I hope that most Americans and most Brits and others around the globe agree that what we're seeing is ludicrous, and they're against censorship, and yet they're afraid. And so I wonder if you have predictions for the coming years. Like, what direction are we going in? Are we going to right things? Are people going to start pushing back more vocally against censorship? Or is it going to take society worsening before hopefully we right ourselves?
It's a very good question. I think I'm quite pessimistic, but not so pessimistic that I've given up. And there's a reason why I'm. Let's say I have my podcast with the Spectator, interviewing these people, because I think it's worth. There's something worth saving here. One part of the censorship. I know you had Michael Schellenberger here, and I was working with him in London last week. he's exposed the censorship industrial complex, to use his phrase, and he argues and shows, with, this started with the Twitter files, he shows how American big government, intelligence, media are colluding with social media, big tech, to censor voices. This, as we've already discussed, trans stuff, but also on COVID, vaccine mandates. The lab leak, for example, that was a conspiracy theory. It was a race. You'd be racist.
You weren't allowed to talk about it.
You weren't allowed to talk about it. Well, we now know patient zero were at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Right.
That Fauci had commissioned gain of function research, which was illegal in America. He paid for it, used American tax dollars to pay for it happening at the Wuhan Institute. That was a story that was censored by Twitter, we know, and almost certainly Facebook and the other social media groups. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's top-down censorship, which Michael has exposed.
Right.
But what it also seems to me is that actually a decent amount of the population, maybe as much as half, maybe more, actually support the censorship.
Right. People
have forgotten why free speech is so important. That's astounding in your country, the country of the Bill of Rights, where it's foundational, and it's astounding in my country, where we were the first proponents in Enlightenment to defend free speech. You know, with John Milton and Areopagitica, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, they were writing tracts in defense of free speech. And that's completely lost, I think, on decent amount of the population. That's very concerning, particularly for the future. If you have this list of artists, or hundreds, are saying we need to censor, they don't appreciate free speech. So what that looks like for the future, I'm a little bit pessimistic, because it's such a massive battle to try and turn that on its head, and I'm certainly fighting for it, but I don't know if it can be won.
And even on a daily basis, it's become so difficult as a consumer to figure out what's true and what's not. I mean, it takes so much work, and I wonder if you have recommendations for authors, journalists, publications who you turn to, maybe in addition to Schellenberger, and I think Matt Taibbi was at the panel you referenced, but if you have recommendations for others who you go to try and get a sense of what's really going on right now.
Well, that's a good question. I think that there's alternative media are crushing at the moment, and it's so exciting. And the famous, in your great country, the famous example is Joe Rogan, who is, I've heard, as much as 40 million people listening to each episode. And that's insane numbers.
Crazy.
Particularly if you think that Tucker at his peak at Fox is getting like 4 million, I think, maybe. So that's 10 times what Tucker Carlson was getting. CNN currently are getting like 300,000 a night, right? So the comparative, like alternative media, where people trust individuals like Rogan to tell the truth, or at least they're on the journey and they know they haven't got an agenda. That's encouraging, and there are a few people like that. And in my country, I think Trigonometry would be an example of a great podcast that I enjoy, and they've been actually got to know those guys, and their heart's totally in the right place, and I really believe they're seeking the truth. You mentioned Schellenberger, he's got his public newsletter, that's great. Taibbi's got his, I think it's called Racket. Barry Weiss, who's been here and with the Free Press, is her, I think she does a great job. I think back in Britain, Unheard do a great job. The Telegraph have started to do better. They weren't so good, I think, during the beginning of the pandemic, but they seem to be doing the most to investigate government censorship. And in fact, I just interviewed Tony Diver, who's one of their investigative journalists and reporters on British censorship by the government, and it's pretty much the same story that Schellenberger uncovered here. and the Twitter files journalists uncovered here about collusion between government and the big tech firms, big tech companies. So there are some. That's one part of the legacy media that seem to be have not veered off too far into the insane. But they could veer again, and so
Right.
I don't want to say. Who knows? Which way they end up going.
Right.
But there's some sanity out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I should probably plug my podcast.
Right.
I would claim that my
mention
podcast,
that too.
The Spectator,
Yeah.
would be one of those places, or at least that's its intention.
Yeah. Well, and I'm interested to hear how you first learned about UATX. Here we are building this new university in Austin. I wonder how you first learned about us.
I'm not entirely sure, but I know that you got a lot of media when you launched.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
there's quite a few people that I'm friends with who are part of that, including Barry Weiss. And I was very excited. I think one of the problems we've seen is the state of academia. A lot of these terrible ideas have been festering in universities over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I haven't yet given up on changing the legacy universities. I think it's sort of insane to discard them all and try and build a thing. But I'm a both and person, so I think let's try and change those and build free speech again in those institutions, and education in a liberal environment where it's okay to think out loud and make mistakes. What you guys are doing here, there's another university in Savannah, Georgia called Woolston College.
Right.
I love that there are new institutions being built as well. And the more there are, the better. It's no easy thing.
Right.
I want you to succeed, but it's going to take a hell of a lot of work, and it's a long project. But let's hope you can do something.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. And as you say, I hope that by building anew, we can inspire reform in existing institutions. I'm very loyal to my alma mater, but also very excited that there are teams now around the world, including at UATX,
What was your alma mater?
we're building anew. I went to the University of Chicago because of its purported dedication to free speech. I really wanted to be somewhere where students were encouraged to speak freely, and the bummer is UChicago is ranked first in terms of free speech. We're supposed to have the freest campus in the country, and if we do, speech isn't that free because there were very real consequences to speaking out at UChicago. There were.
What were some of your experiences?
I got on campus as the political minority and just spoke freely, kind of as I was encouraged to do, and there were really very real social consequences. I mean, in my dorm freshman year, girls would drop the door on me. They stopped acknowledging me once they learned that I was conservative, which was painful. And then during the COVID years, especially, it became difficult to challenge the status quo. Dorian Abbott is a professor at the University of Chicago, and he released the story that the university was discriminating in hiring and admissions at the graduate level based upon race and sex, which is against the law. And students responded to him by trying to deplatform and punish him rather than be astounded that the university was discriminating unlawfully. They went after him, and a lot of stories of cancellation and craziness at UChicago, which made me very, very sad because I had hoped that UChicago would be freer. And I do think there are groups on campus fighting to change things. I started a newspaper called The Chicago Thinker that really pushed back. Dorian himself has created a group of faculty called UChicago Free. So there are a lot of movements at work, but we have a ways to go at entrenched universities.
Yeah, that's so sad to hear.
Yeah.
It's very painful, I think, being ostracized for having the wrong opinions.
Yeah.
It's so unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's one of the great tragedies of the time, I think.
Yeah.
I think they'll look back and realize, so what, they had different opinions.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson said, if we all think the same, then no one's thinking.
Right.
You'd think at university that diversity of thought would be cherished,
Right.
particularly in America, of all places.
Right. You would hope so. And Barry made a good point the other day that it's just so boring. If everyone thinks the same and says the same thing, it's so dull. Like, forget expanding knowledge and truth-seeking and all of that, which is very noble. Just on a day-to-day basis, it's boring if everyone is the same. So I hope more people begin to acknowledge that. And I'm inspired by podcasts such as yours and the work that's being done, because I do see growing movements to change things, and I'm a little pessimistic too, but I'm hopeful at the same time.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, thank you so much for chatting with me. I
Audrey,
really,
thank you for having me.
really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's great to be here.